Welcome to our meeting on the use of oral history and archives. We have two very prominent guests. One is Rob Perks, and the other is Mary Stewart. Me and Rob, we go back to 1996 when the first Oral History Association was transforming from a movement to an association, so we witnessed this historic moment together in Sweden. Since then, we also used his oral history reader with Al Thompson a lot in our classroom. They are both from the British Library Oral History section, which we used to call Sound Archive. And they are also both connected to Oral History Society, which is the British Oral History Association. So today we will start with Rob, and we will hear from. Do you have a title for your presentation? Title?
The title? The PowerPoint?
PowerPoint'u başlatabilir miyiz? I will read it. Family History and Oral History, a case study.
No, that's the next one.
That's the next one. Oh, that's you. Okay. The emergence of oral history as a methodology for exploring the past and its relationship to the present. The word is yours.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Artsu, for your introduction. The last time I was in Istanbul was 2000, and that was a very significant moment, I think, both in the history of the international oral history movement, but also, I think, for oral history in Turkey. And Artsu and your colleague, whose name escapes me, Gunhan Danishman.
A few years ago, yeah.
He sadly missed. He was just amazing at really pulling things together at what was quite a difficult moment, I think, in many ways within what was happening in oral history, and particularly what was happening in Turkey at the time. So it's fantastic to be back here. Thank you very much to the Foundation for inviting my colleague Mary and I to Istanbul. It is really great to be here, and wherever Aisha is, thank you, Aisha, for a fantastic day that we've had today, looking round and just refreshing my memory about how amazing Istanbul is. So, that said, let me now give you some context. Basically what Mary and I are going to do is we're going to spend up to the next 45 minutes or so doing two things, one of which is to set the context for the oral history as a methodology. And I'm going to talk more about the origins of oral history, how it relates to various disciplines of academic study, some of the key moments of transformation within the modern history of oral history, and some of the challenges that we're facing now as modern oral historians. And then Mary is going to pick up and use family history as a case study. And in both cases, we're really drawing very much on our own experience within our own work at the British Library, and Mary will talk more about that. And I'm hoping in questions, if you've got more questions you want to ask us about what we do at the British Library and the many projects that we run, then we can talk more about that later. But let me start with the phrase oral history. Now, I don't know how oral history translates into Turkish or Armenian. It seems to translate into many different languages in different ways. But in English, there's an ambiguity in the phrase oral history, because if you spell it with an O, it's about speaking. If you spell it, as you see here, with an AU, it sounds the same, oral, oral, but oral is about listening. And in actual fact, it's quite a nice ambiguity for us to be thinking about, because although we do spell it with an O continuously in all our publications and writings, when oral history started as a modern movement, there was mixed feelings in the English-speaking world about how you should spell it. Because, of course, listening to the past and to people's memories is as important as them speaking them, because this is what we do as oral historians. So in many ways, oral history, although we spell it with an O, is as appropriate as an AU, because it's to do with listening to history. And that's, of course, what we're all doing. And I've given you two quotations here from two very important figures in the history of modern oral history. One is Ron Greeley from Columbia University in New York, one of the very important figures in the development of US oral history. And I think his definition still is a very important one for us, which focuses on interviewing eyewitness participants in the events of the past for the purposes of historical reconstruction. And the key is reconstruction. In other words, you're gathering evidence from people's memories, from their experiences and opinions, in order to reconstruct what happened in the past. And at a very simple level, that's what oral history is doing. But as Lynn Abrams points out in her book, which is simply called Oral History Theory, and if any of you are beginning to get involved in oral history, the one book I would suggest that you read about the theory of oral history is Lynn Abrams' book, Oral History Theory. It's in its second edition. It's really great. And as you can see here, she makes a further point, which is oral history is both the process of gathering. So when we all go out and interview people, older people within our own communities and workplaces and families, it's the process of doing it, but she also points out that it's the product of that. And this puts an emphasis, I think, on a lot of things that oral historians spend a lot of time thinking about, which is the interview relationship, and to use a phrase I'll come back to later, the co-construction of that historical evidence between the interviewer and the interviewee. But also what you then do to analyse it as historians, as sociologists. So it produces evidence which we then analyse in different ways, and we may triangulate that material with other types of historical evidence. So I think it's a very good starting point, because it immediately begins to problematise what we do as oral historians. We're speaking, we're listening, we're gathering, we're also analysing. And people often ask, well, what makes oral history different from other types of interview? Because a lot of people mistake what I think of oral history as something else, which is interviewing in different contexts. So if you say you're recording an interview with someone, there's lots of other ways, as I've indicated here, that it might be an interview, which is different from oral history. It might be a job interview, it might be a police interview, might be a security interview, it might be a marketing interview. There's all sorts of interviews there can be, and frequently journalistic interviews are sometimes thought of as oral history. But I think there's something different going on in an oral history interview. And I've listed here some of the points that I think denotes what makes an oral history interview different. First of all, it's generally one-to-one, and I know that is culturally specific, and that changes between different cultures. It's generally recorded in a permanent way, often on a tape recorder. It's open-ended and free-flowing, so it's not using a questionnaire as you would in a marketing campaign. And most importantly, you're creating a new historical source. And I'm going to come back to how important that is later. In other words, you're not just doing it to get information to write a journalistic article. You're getting it in order to create something that's new that you can analyse and share in different ways. And I think that really marks oral history out differently from many other types of interview that we talk about. And very important to our practice, and those of you who are coming on the workshop tomorrow will talk quite a lot about this, is consent. And the notion of empowering interviewees, but then involving them in how their material is used by historians and how it's reused in different public contexts. So this idea of informed consent is very important to our practice as oral historians. Now we think frequently of oral history, therefore, particularly in the historical academy, oral history is frequently thought of as very new, as a new methodology, something that is brand new and change the way in which historians operate. But the most important thing I think for us to remember is that it has very deep origins which go back long before the invention of the technology that we all use to gather these memories. So just in the European context, we have two people who can sometimes be regarded as pioneers of gathering oral testimony. In Herodotus, the Greek historian, 400 years before Christ, was gathering eyewitness testimony of the Persian Wars and using those to write history. And we have a British equivalent somewhat later, the Venerable Bede, who was writing the history of the English church and people, and he sent, we wouldn't call them interviewers, people around Britain, or England as it was then called, to gather eyewitness accounts in his written text. So we can point to very early historians, a very long time ago, who were using what in many ways we could now see as oral testimony. Oral evidence was being gathered. And in the more global context, of course, there's a whole series of traditions that we can point to which long predate the late 19th century invention of tape recorders and technology and the media which we're familiar with. So you'll know this from your own experience working in Turkey, that oral tradition and folklore has very long roots in terms of the study and writing and development in many parts of the world. So particularly if we think about the development of oral history in Africa and India, a very strong tradition of oral tradition, sometimes in song, poetry, storytelling, goes back very many centuries. And a lot of those influences feed into what has become the modern oral history movement in all those places and underpin oral history. So Mary and I, some years ago, went to the inaugural conference of the Indian Oral History Association, and people were standing up saying, well, this is all new, this oral history, but we've been doing this for centuries. You know, this Indian poetry and storytelling goes back a long way, and of course it does. So there's a number of roots and disciplines that have informed the modern oral history movement, and oral tradition is an important one. Family history is an important one. If you think of Alex Haley's book Roots, which really transformed the way in which black Americans began to think about their role in America and the slavery experience, that has very strong reverberations for family history and the importance of family history. In other parts of the world, we have folklore being codified, and organisations are set up doing folklore, which in some ways is very similar to what we would now do as oral historians, but perhaps is focusing more on song and poetry and fictional as opposed to witnessed experience. So the Irish Folklore Commission is a very famous example. It's set up in the 1930s as part of, and this is very important I think in the Turkish context, set up as part of forging a new nation. So the Irish Folklore Commission was using folklore and oral history to express a new nation in formation at that time through the Republic, the emergence of the Republic of Ireland. So you can see there where history was absolutely central to nationhood in that context. Another very strong tradition I mentioned here is life writing. So this isn't oral history from the point of view of recording oral evidence. It's people drawing on their own memories of their own lives and then writing. Lots of work that's been done in Scandinavia, Finland, Norway, Denmark, was people encouraged to write things down, and that also then led into the development of oral history in those places. And the final influence that I'm picking up here is linguistics and the study of speech for the analysis of accents and dialects and language. And there's a very important crossover in many parts of the world between linguists gathering, in many ways, what we would regard as oral history material, which is of interest to us as historians, but they're analysing it for their own purposes as linguists. So that in Britain, there's the Survey of English Dialects, which we can use as oral historians, but a lot of the work that Mary and I do is used by linguists to study what the words and not what people are saying. So there's an important crossover here which I think we need to be aware of. Another important influence in the British context was socialism and the changes that were happening within the 19th century in Britain. And here you see some very important names who were social investigators, using the interview methodology to get at working class experience, partly as campaigning around housing and poverty and disease within urban Britain and particularly in London. And all these were very influential as proponents of the interview methodology that we now use. I think, though, that the real change happens around or just after the Second World War. After the Second World War, certainly in English-speaking countries, there's a major shift away from elite political history towards the study of social history. And therefore, it's rather ironic that the first organisation that emerges anywhere in the world that calls itself an oral history organisation is based at Columbia University in New York. That's not the ironic bit. The ironic bit is that they do elite oral history. So what Alan Nevins is doing in the 1940s is that he's interviewing politicians, industrialists. He does a major book on the Ford Motor Company, but it's very top-down. It's using oral history methodology and gathering evidence, but about significant people within US society. Now that changes, and Columbia is now, you know, a completely different organisation. And it's certainly true to say that when oral history starts in other parts of the world, very few of them emulate this elite focus, which is typical of the Columbian example. The other thing that they do, which is very controversial, is that they regard the transcript as the text, and they destroy the tapes. Now, this is complete anathema to us now, of course, as archivists. The idea that, you know, Mary and I would be gathering this material and transcribing it and then throwing the tapes away it's just craziness. But it gives you a sense then of how challenging it was to think of the tape as the document. For a long time, historians began to think of the transcript as the document. Now, you can see how that in that intervening period, how that it's completely changed. You know, now we know now the deficiencies of the transcript. We know it's not always close to the original source, and it's the tape that we regard as the source. And that raises, therefore, all sorts of issues about archiving, which I'm going to say more about in a moment. So in a sense, this is where the modern movement starts. And as I say, the course of oral history then is different in different parts of the world, but generally is quite different in terms of being seen as a bottom-up movement. So in the UK, we have two very important strands of development. One is sociological strand, which is represented by Paul Thompson, who we know very well, who I think this book that you see in front of you, certainly the first edition has been translated into Turkish and is still widely available. The fourth edition has come out. And I think Paul Thompson, more than anybody else, really establishes oral history as a very distinctive methodology within the academy. So if you look at that book, it's still the case with the fourth edition, it's arguing the historiographical case for oral history and positioning it within these disciplines which I'm beginning to talk about. But he is a sociologist. Now, isn't that interesting that although he's talking about oral history, it's coming from a sociological base. So although he started his training very much as I did, really, as a leftist Labour historian, he became a sociologist and began to draw on the Chicago School of Sociology to then apply that to the development of oral history from, as you see here, 1969 onwards. But he was also looking at another strand of development, which was from George Evans, who is regarded as, if Paul's regarded as the father of British oral history, then George Evans is the grandfather of oral history. He hated the phrase oral history. He said it reminded him of a dentist's waiting room. What he preferred was spoken history, which is fine, but we've got oral history. But George published a whole series of books, the most famous one you see here, which were all based on interviews with his neighbours in a rural part of Britain in East Anglia at a time when it was still possible to go back very many generations. So he was drawing on that sort of roots, oral tradition, oral folklore tradition to gather evidence about agricultural communities from 1870s onwards, actually. Now, I mentioned oral history and archives, and embedding the archival imperative has been a very important part of our practice in many parts of the world. And Raphael Samuel, whose name may be familiar to some of you, who set up the History Workshop movement in the 1960s, really changed the face of history in many ways. He, as early as 1971, was really seeing the importance of historians enshrining the archival imperative within their practice at a very early stage. So he began to see historians as archivists, and that practice has been one that's been certainly taken up in most Western, North American, South African, Australasian countries, but perhaps is less typical in various other places in the world, and we can perhaps talk more about that later. But what I'm talking about here really is oral history as a radical movement. So from very early on, oral history was seen as a tool to challenge elite, male, nationalist history by giving a voice to those that have been marginalized by traditional historians and traditional archival sources. So there's some books here about criminality, about gay and lesbian movement, about migration, about women's experiences, which were very typical of that early period. And from then on, I think from the 70s onwards, the pace of change within oral history picks up very significantly and begins to emerge as a very significant practice globally. So you can see here from as early as the 1966, we have a US Oral History Association, followed very quickly by associations in the UK and Australia, and so it goes on. And each of these was drawing on all these different traditions which I'm talking about. So anthropology, folklore, local history, sociology, archiving, increasingly gender studies as gender studies begins to emerge, and gradually psychology and psychiatry as well. So in a sense, this is the amazing strength about oral history, is that it takes little bits from all these disciplines and applies them to what we're doing, which is basically extracting people's memories and experiences from inside their memory, inside their heads. And I think that's why, in many ways, oral history is able to be applied in so many different contexts. The other thing that happens, I think, from the 1980s is that oral history begins to be problematized. So from a period where we saw it simply as a means of getting more information about the past from these various groups that had been marginalized, we begin to think more about the nature of the relationship, of the interview, what's actually going on when I go and sit with an older person and they talk to me. What do I bring to that encounter? Do they always tell me the truth? Do they always tell me what they remember? What do they tell me? Do they reorder it? Do they tell the story in a different way at a different time to a different audience? And a whole series of things begin to emerge when you think about that encounter. So a lot of discussion now, as I'm sure you know, within oral history, is around issues like subjectivity. Famously, Alessandro Portelli, Italian oral historian, encouraged us to think about subjectivity, and therefore encouraged us to think about weaknesses as strengths. So the fact that people misremember, the fact they put things in a different order, the fact that they forget things, the fact that there are silences, the fact that people make things up, all have a purpose and a reason to explain how they reconcile what they now remember between what happened at the time. So it's this reconciliation between the past and the present that oral history is now, I think, incredibly well positioned to examine for us as historians within the academy. So here we talk about memory theory, and memory theories emerged very much from the sort of things I've been talking about. But we're also thinking about intertextuality, so how an oral source can be compared with a diary or a newspaper. These are also increasingly interesting, as I think, as oral historians. From the 1980s onwards, you therefore see oral history emerging in slightly a different way. You get an explosion in those areas in the West into new areas beyond history, museums and libraries, higher education, the study, number of courses expands and so on. But also in all these countries that you see here on the slide, oral history is emerging at a particular political moment of change. So, for instance, in the countries of the former Soviet Union, oral history has been seen as a way of reconstructing a past that was forbidden, was repressed, which was forgotten, which was in many ways destroyed. So in other words, if there are no documents, you have to use oral history to reconstruct that experience. So I was doing a lot of work myself in Ukraine and Russia in the early 90s, working with historians there who were quickly beginning to reconstruct what had happened under the Soviet period through the memories of people themselves. Obviously big issues there about people's willingness to speak, about how reliable archives are or are not, which all have resonances, I'm sure, for you and for other people in many parts of the world doing oral history at the moment, and no doubt we'll come back and talk about these things. Latin America, similar period of long totalitarian rule, and oral history emerges as a way of gathering evidence about that period. In some cases for recompense, for recognition, for compensation, but in many ways as a form of reconciliation, which of course is the context in South Africa post-apartheid, where you see oral history being actively funded by the incoming ANC government as a way of restoring that sense of identity for those that have been repressed, and gathering prison memories. Any of you been to Robben Island prison where Mandela was incarcerated? One of the first things you're aware of is the Prison Memories Project and people's voices who were incarcerated there through the visitor experience. That's a very important part of that. So political change and political moments have been a very important shift for the development of modern oral history. And you can see here some other examples of more recent oral history associations. So I was recently at the Greek Oral History Association we set up very recently, and that's expanding very rapidly indeed. I think you're in fact going to Athens quite soon, aren't you? In May, which would be fantastic. And I really hope to see a Turkish Oral History Association. It would be fantastic, wouldn't it?
We'll talk about it.
Okay, let's talk about that afterwards. So what is it that, I'm coming to the end of what I'm saying here. What is it that continues to drive oral history globally? Well, as I've been indicating, I think it's about marginalised voices. Everywhere that it's emerged as a methodology and a technique, it's to validate and collect marginalised voices, forgotten and repressed stories, and creating archives of that material. And thereby, it's empowering people and giving them a voice in that process, often a political or emerging political process. But it's also an advocacy tool. Increasingly, it's an advocacy tool. And I've given some examples here. I've talked about women's studies and gender, sexual orientation, of course, a lot of gay and lesbian oral history now, particularly in the States, also in Europe, Western Europe generally, where oral history is a very important tool for creating a history of gay experience, which simply doesn't exist in any other way. Disability, ethnicity, legal redress, a lot of land rights oral history going on in Australia, New Zealand, other parts of the world. And as I'm sure you've seen in the press, we've had lots of institutionalised child abuse in Britain, Australia, Canada. Again, oral history has been an important tool for gathering those voices. So let me summarise, and I'm going to throw out some quick challenges. I'm going to hand over to Mary. So what have I been saying? I've been saying that oral history emerges from many different disciplines, but it draws on all those disciplines and benefits, I think, from them. That it's moved from an empirical sort of rescuing evidence base to one that's a lot more about memory, thinking about memory, and thinking about the interview relationship. I've talked about the growth of oral history and how it's mainstreamed. And you can see oral history everywhere. When I first started doing oral history, no one knew what it was, and it was very seen as slightly odd. slightly strange. What is this oral history? Whereas now it's everywhere. Certainly in the UK, you can see it in museums, history of science, environmental, crisis, caring context, using oral history with older people in caring contexts, and so on. So it's now everywhere. It's very pervasive. There's been a debate about how we analyse the data. What's the role of archives in this? Can people who are coming at the archive really understand the habitus of the interview? That's been another debate we've had. Sean Field, South African context, has talked about the role of regenerative memory work. In other words, can memory have a therapeutic role within change and crisis or post-conflict? And he's written a lot about apartheid, but also there's been work on, for instance, the armed struggle in Northern Ireland, and we've got a conference coming up later in this year about this. And of course, the key shift latterly has been the digital revolution, and how is that having an impact? And Mary's going to say more about this in a moment. So just a few things to throw out at you, and I'm going to stop. I've mentioned the internet. The internet is creating major ethical challenges for us in terms of access to personal data. So there's lots of questions there that perhaps we can pick up in the discussion afterwards. And it's something that Mary and I are constantly worrying about when we're putting oral history online. Is it okay? Is it not okay? Should certain things not be online? Should we put parts online? How's it going to have an impact on family members? Mary's going to talk about this, and so on. The other thing, which is increasingly a challenge, is I suppose, oral history in non-democratic environments. Can you do oral history in non-democratic environments? Do non-democratic environments allow the independence of movement for people to get proper stories truthfully told, freely told, and then safely secured in safe archives? And perhaps we'll come back to this later. And that feeds into archives. Archives are a very important part of this story. Do they have the resources? Because they've got this huge backlog of things that are analogue, aren't digital, which they're worrying about. Because we've got about 15 years to digitise all the remaining analogue stuff in our archives before it disappears, before the people that know how to work the equipment and the equipment, it all disappears. So archives have got a real headache of how to deal with all that backlog. How can they begin to deal with all the digital stuff that's coming down the line, and what challenges does that pose? And that's even before you start talking about video. So ask me about video afterwards. I'm going to hand over to Mary, but I hope I've given you a good context within which to place what I think Mary's going to say. So I'll hand over to Mary. We just need to switch the. Is it carrying straight on?
While waiting, Mary, I have a few points.
Yes.
The Columbia University Oral History Office, they also interviewed Turkish elite back in the 1930s, and my friend Dario Mizrahi transcribed. He was a student in the anthropology department working on Karagöz, actually, and he transcribed those those tapes. And like your Irish folklore commission, Turkey has people's houses, which collected, which had access to many local people. I don't recall any interview format, but we had lots of reports from the local people's narratives about the past, which we did not. I did not see any research coming out of that, but there are some early recorded early records of local memory in those areas.
Right. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Mary, the word is yours.
Hello, is this microphone on? Yes, it is. Thank you, everyone. It's lovely to be here. It's my first visit to Turkey, so it's been a really interesting day, and I'm sure will be more interesting as the evening goes on and we have our workshop tomorrow. So I'm really moving from the very broad overview that Rob has given you about oral history generally to a much more specific case study, which is on family history, family historians and their use of archived oral history. And I think what's apparent I need to state from the outset is that I'm really talking about my experience working in a UK and Western context. And what's fascinating for me, and I'm looking forward to finding out more, is about family history and the role of family history within oral history within the Turkish context. So I'm interested to see what questions come up. The presentation is based on my work at the British Library as a fellow curator alongside Rob. And also my master's thesis was on my own family history. So I have to own up and say I'm a family historian as well as working in oral history, where I looked at my great-great-grandfather's migration from Scotland to New Zealand in the 19th century. So I'm interested in this topic from both angles. So first, a little bit of context, I think, about family history in the UK. And I'm very keen to know what the situation is like within Turkey. But in Britain, and I think within lots of other places within the West, family history is a massively popular activity. Thank you. Many people are studying their family history. There's a popular programme on the BBC called Who Do You Think You Are, where a celebrity, though they're increasingly getting less famous and I don't recognise who they are 10 series in, rediscovers their family history throughout an hour of television. And I think this has also inspired more people, and the roadshow and live event associated with this programme had 13,000 people attend last year over 3 days, all interested in finding out stories about their past. It's much easier to do this work now. There's a host of websites, Ancestry.com, Find My Past, who are all enabling family history researchers to find out more information from online sources and also to publish that material as well. Create your own family tree, record little stories, put up photographs. And the internet and social media have been very useful for people to reconnect, the story. Through Facebook, I found my great uncle who I hadn't seen in 40 years. So it's been quite an enabler there. There's also many more archival sources available online, such as within Britain, the census, which happens every 10 years. And then it's a 100-year lag before the material is available online. So now people can look at the individual census data for each household and each individual in Britain from 1911 and each 10 years before that. So there's lots more people doing this work, and there's a lot more people with the tools enabling them to do that work without having to necessarily travel all around the country and look in small little churches and gravestones, although people still definitely do that. I think there's also a trend now to find the stories about family members. It's not just kind of more like a kind of stamp collection where you have to find every single name and every single date of who was born here and died here. People want to know the stories and the people and the lives behind those names and dates of the family members that they're researching. And this is where the link is into oral history. All family history advice sites, including the BBC, say the first thing you need to do is talk to your family members. Who's alive? Who's the oldest person alive? Go and talk to them and find out some family stories. And that's used as the starting point for research to then go and find out which archives you need to look at and then take the story from then. The BBC history site, one of the most popular, advises recording these conversations if the family member consents. So you've got potentially an audio or video recording of that conversation. On the other flip side, thinking about oral history and the family. So almost all oral history, even if it's a subject-specific interview, so about being a social worker in Bradford in the 1970s, almost all of those recordings will start with some biographical information, partly because that's seen as the easy start to ease an interviewee into talking about themselves and getting relaxed to then talk about the real part of the interview. Even though I think we all realise that sometimes for some families, talking about the family is actually quite complex and complicated. It's not always something that we can assume. Certainly within the library, our focus is on life story recordings, which try and record the whole of someone's biographical details, including their work and family life and relationships. and hobbies and leisure and politics and all of those things. So certainly within those life story recordings, family is really focused on in depth for at least the first session, first 2 or 3 hours of the recording. I think traditionally, oral historians have often used interviews to analyse the mechanics of the family group. Do family dynamics change, particularly with changes in women's rights, changes in the way that work is divided in the household? Certainly, I think we can see that in some of Paul Thompson's early work, in terms of the Edwardians, in terms of his work on 100 Families project, where he was looking at change and social change and development within different generations of the family. And certainly, I think, thinking about the turn that Rob was talking about, with oral history being problematised from the 1980s onwards, I think family dynamics and memories, particularly of childhood, are definitely examined in more detail by oral historians as they're thinking about those ideas of how people remember, why they remember, how they perform those memories within the context of that particular interview encounter. And certainly, we must recognise that one person's narrative of that particular family dynamic or family is one view into what is obviously a collective memory, and different family members will have different views on what may have happened. So they're two related, but they are distinct disciplines. As Rob has mentioned, an oral history recording is the historical source in its own right. It may be used alongside other resources, but it's certainly not just the jumping off point for further archival research, as it's often used within a family history context. Certainly the family is a very important, but it's only one potential audience for the oral histories that are collected, and certainly that we archive at the British Library, which are preserved in the long term. And I think also the idea that the interviewee decides and has control through the informed consent process about how their interview is accessed and listened to is very different. It has to be approached very differently within the family contexts, because you have obviously the interviewer, if they're in the family, has a stake and a role within that family story that they are listening to. So it's very hard to switch off your ears and say, okay, my great aunt doesn't want me to tell my mum what's been said in this interview, when you're actually part of the story yourself. I think these two groups there's growing interaction between family historians and oral historians, and certainly within the Oral History Society there's a group of us trying to think about how we might publicise some of our practice and work with the family history community to think about oral history recordings within the family. I've got the link here. We've come up with a joint statement of intent about the oral history recording, so it's quite hard to say, you're my mum, will you give me copyright in the words you've said in this recording? Quite difficult conversation to have. You're also not necessarily going to have an archive who wants to take that recording. You may do, but you may not. So we're trying to get someone to think in advance about some of the potential tricky things that may come up in that interview and how to handle them, and have that conversation with your great aunt, even though it might be quite difficult. It's much easier to have set the parameters before that recording takes place than to deal with any difficulties that come up afterwards. And if any of you are interviewing in the family and you use any of the information we've got there, please do feedback to us your experiences of the advice we've given. Would really like to hear how it works in practice. So why would you consider family history? What's the point of me talking about this today? Certainly, and I can't believe I haven't put this on the bullet point, interviewees themselves within an oral history context certainly consider their family. They consider many of the times when interviewees decide to restrict access to a particular part of the interview. It's not for legal reasons, it's not for potentially political sensitivities, it's because they think, help, I really don't want my daughter to hear what I've just said. I'd rather it was closed for 20 years and I'm dead, and then they can listen to it. So actually it's very often in the forefront of the interviewee's mind is the family members who might be listening to those recordings. I think there's, as I've outlined, some interesting methodological crossovers, and I'm interested and hoping to do some further research with family historians who are recording oral history and oral historians who have or haven't dared to interview within their own family. But the meat of what I'm going to talk about today is increased access to archived oral history. which has mainly stemmed from my job at the library. Within oral history, we generally don't anonymise people or give them pseudonyms, and even if you do, someone who knows the person will be able to tell from their voice who's speaking. There's an increased number of online catalogues and online access to recordings, so soon I think it will be a regular part of a family historian's toolkit to think about going to particular archives, looking at online sources, and to search some oral history catalogues. So I'm going to talk today about the implications we need to think about as oral historians and oral history archivists about family history. First of all is about the opportunities that family history offers to enrich research. Second is about some of the reactions of family members to the oral histories that we have archived within the British Library, and some interviews I conducted with family members. And finally, the tricky and most potentially interesting part about the ethics that we need to start thinking about, and the questions that are being asked of us, and some of the thought processes we're going through to try and develop how we deal with the various positive aspects and complaints or ethical dilemmas we've had with some of the recordings that we've put online. First of all, and I think I need to say that I've done some work on this with a colleague in Britain called Cynthia Brown, who's also a trustee of the Oral History Society, so I think I need to acknowledge her work on this part of the presentation, to do with archived oral history as a source for family history. So even if you aren't lucky enough or unlucky enough to find your relative within an archived oral history collection, there's still a massive potential that someone recording their family, or someone researching their family history, can use oral history. It can provide such a wonderful context for understanding what your relative may have done as an occupation. So Cynthia has done some really interesting research on various factories and occupations within Leicester, where she lives. And you could, by listening to someone who had done a similar occupation, understand much more about the daily working life and living conditions and noise of working within a particular industry. So there's a great value in listening to someone who had a similar potential experience, certainly in terms of where ancestors lived. If you think about, there are parts of, there certainly will be, there are in London, there will be within Istanbul, certain parts of the city that have particular characteristics or potentially have particular stories or events that have happened within them. And listening to some oral histories with people who may have been there at a similar time to a family member, or have had a similar role within those events, can be absolutely fantastic to really get to the point of what was it like. That idea, it's not just about oral history as information, it's about oral history as emotion. You might be able to think more about, how did my ancestor feel, what might have presented them in terms of sound, of sight, of emotion, of those very raw events that happen. And finally, and this relates to some work at the library that's done by our colleague, who's a curator of sociolinguistics, is thinking about how people may have spoken. And I think there's real richness that one can discover by listening to someone who may have died 20 or 30 years ago, and thinking about how actually our ancestors may have sounded. You get so much more information than you would from reading the documents, even from looking at photographs, by hearing voices of someone who will have had a very similar experience. Oh, sorry. So on to the research that I conducted in 2008 and 2009, and then more recently as well, which is really based on my work at the library as a curator. And for a long time, I was the initial point of contact in email and phone from people phoning up and saying, my dad's just died, and I've just discovered that he did an interview with you, and I would like it, please. I had quite a number of these, usually following someone's death, a family member phoning me up and saying, I'd like the recording. One that I had was quite interesting, was someone saying, my dad's just died, we're having a big family celebration, I'd like to play his oral history to my mum as a surprise. I had to say, well, I'm not sure, it might be a good surprise, it might be a shocking surprise. Are you sure this is necessarily what you want to do? It's not my family. I don't know. And give him some thoughts about that. I don't think he did in the end. And also this research relates to life story recordings, so to these very long 8, 12, 15-hour recordings that we specialise in the library. So they do contain a lot of family information. I haven't done so much research with, and haven't got so many examples where it's a much shorter interview, although I know people find a 1 or 2 or 3 hour interview of great value too. First of all, I was struck by a letter I was shown from a widow of an interviewee who said he had died, she'd listened to his recording, and she loved the experience of listening. And when she pushed stop on the tape recorder, as it was then, she had lots of questions, and she was devastated. She said, I've got all these questions, and there's no one left to answer them. It was a very emotional experience for her, being almost sitting alongside that person again, and then once the recording was finished, that person was once again gone. And I think, as I'm sure you all know from having worked in oral history, is what came through from the interviews that I did with two different family members who had their family members' recording was archived with us at the library, was the power of the voice. That actually, I have a number of examples where people said, I've read the transcript of the interview, I've got photographs, I just can't listen. It's just going to be too much for me. I've put it in a cupboard, I know exactly where it is, I've told my daughter where it is, I know it, but I can't listen yet. And that's really come up a number of times, that actually listening really does have that great emotional resonance. What I'm going to talk about in a case study in particular coming up is the intersection between oral history and family history. So if one is positioned within the story of the family, often you come armed with knowledge, you know about some of the events, and you can see the difference with an interviewer who is an outsider, may not know exactly which questions to ask, and there may be sections of an interviewee's life they can gloss over completely within an oral history interview conducted by a third party. They just don't go there. Doesn't mean that the oral history interview is untruthful, it means it just isn't necessarily what that interviewee wanted to disclose at the time. But also the oral history interview by a third party offers a whole lot of potentially new information. You will ask questions of someone else's father in a very different way than you will to your own. There will be things that you feel comfortable about asking directly that you just would not ask your own family member. And that does reveal more new information within the family. I think that does then potentially mean that the oral history interview, although for us as archivists it's recorded, it's finished, it's nicely catalogued, it's preserved, for the family, often the oral history interview for the interviewee and the family members themselves can have an afterlife. So my case study here is in the back with the glasses and the brown jacket is Charles Pick, who was a publisher who was born in 1933 and died in 2000, and he was interviewed for our large, extensive oral history project called Book Trade Lives with the publishing industry. In front is his son Martin, who I interviewed in 2008 about his father's interview. He was also worked in the publishing industry, often with his father, and then at this point where I came across him, by complete coincidence, his father-in-law had been interviewed by us at the library too. I got talking to Martin and decided he would be a really interesting person to talk to about his thoughts about his father's interview. And Martin was also studying narrative theory at that point as well as part of a master's degree. So he was really in the idea of thinking about stories. Within the oral history and within the interview that I had with Martin, and I'll play a little clip in a minute, one large part of Charles's childhood was revealed, and one large part was hidden within the oral history recording. It was done by my very skilled colleague Sue Bradley. Charles had grown up in a culturally Jewish household. It wasn't very practicing, but he decided not to talk about that in any way, shape or form within the interview. Just did not want to do that. We can possibly speculate that he didn't want to do that within the 1930s and 40s when he was a child. Obviously, he was in a spectre of great times of anti-Semitism, so perhaps it was just not something he wanted to consider. However, within the interview, he revealed a very important memory of his childhood, which his son knew nothing about, which was that Charles's father had gone bankrupt, his business had failed, the family's life had changed completely, and they'd had to move house, change school. It was a massive emotional event within their childhood, within Charles's childhood, which he had not conveyed to the family. So if I can play the clip, which is called Martin Pick, please.
But I think Sue Bradley's persistence in coming back to wanting to understand what he wasn't revealing about about the family did have an impact, because after the last interview she did with him, he said to me, by then he was living in Sussex near the hospital where he'd been diagnosed with the brain tumour. He said to me, I want to talk to you about my childhood. And then he broke down. He said it was so painful and I've never been able to talk about it. I want you to know how terrible it was. That was about as far as he could go. And I was dying to ask him a lot more, but I just felt he couldn't cope with it. I did, however, manage in subsequent years to talk to his elder brother, George, who died aged 94. And he was much more explicit. I mean, he hadn't hidden things to the extent that my father had.
So I think that's quite interesting, and it says quite a lot within that clip about the effect on Charles of his illness, which happened as the interview was going on, but also then how the interview itself sparked him to be able to talk to his son slightly about his childhood, and then after Charles had died, Martin listened to the interview and found out much more. It also sparked further family conversations as Martin wanted to go and find out more and spoke to Charles's brother. So the interview has many different resonances and feelings and emotions within the family that I think are important for us to remember as oral history interviewers and archivists. The next bit I want to talk about is when we're going into slightly more tricky ground potentially, which is, as our recordings are much more available online and the catalogues that we have are much more available online, and often the recordings themselves, because we don't anonymise our interviewees or the people that they discuss in recordings, we're going to have more and more people finding mentions of themselves or a family member by someone that they may not ever have met themselves, a work colleague of one's father, potentially an ex-girlfriend or boyfriend of one's mother might be talking in detail about your own family member. That potentially could be quite interesting and could release much more new information about the family member that one is looking at, but it also could lead to quite tricky situations. And the example I'm going to play here is from an artist called Jane Dowling, and what she is discussing a time when she was in hospital in the 1950s, and some friends of her father's visited her, including a doctor called Evan Jones. And she talks a bit about Evan Jones. So if we could play that other clip that I have, please.
So I went to Thomas's for about a month for tests and things, and all his friends came to see me, and one in particular called Evan Jones, who was an amazing doctor. I mean, people used to sit up in the wards when he passed and sort of feel better. He was Evan used to drink. Later on he developed diabetes, but he wasn't any good at personal relationships, but he was wonderful. Well, he just lived for medicine. I mean, a lot of doctors were deliberately very clinical when they examined you, sort of wash their hands and, sort of. But Evan used to just give his patients a big hug. And then he dropped dead. He went fishing, and he dropped dead on some loch in Scotland. 10 years before that, he told me he'd give himself 10 years, and he was exactly right.
So if I was a family member of Evan Jones, I may be absolutely delighted to hear about this wonderful physician with this amazing touch who his patients loved. I may know that he potentially used to drink lots of alcohol, that he had difficulties with his own personal relationships, that he'd foreseen his own death, or maybe that would be brand new information for me. It's not an uncomplicated thing hearing someone else narrate these stories about one's family member. And that's what I'm going to talk about in my last few minutes. We've had a number of ethical quandaries come up, particularly as we're releasing more information and more oral history interviews online, such as that of Jane Dowling. And we need to have a real balance here. I'm a human being, and I'm a daughter, a mother, a granddaughter. I think we have to think about how we ourselves would react to listening to some of the very frank discussions we have by our narrators of other people who they've encountered in their lives. But also, despite that empathy, we need to also keep our mind on oral history's mission, which is to record those first-hand testimonies and make them available to research. I don't want to be censoring what the narrator themselves wished to say, unless it could potentially get the library sued, in which case I would probably close the recording for a certain period of time. But these aren't generally about legal issues, these are about ethical sensitivities. And now that the recordings are far more widely available than potentially the narrators, particularly in the age when they were speaking, but if it was before the mid-90s, were speaking before the age of internet access, it's a very different context in which we are listening, and which we are, as curators, making that available, that material so widely available. We've had a number of cases, although we've put thousands of interviews online now, I think we're more, well, I hope, I say, that more people are likely to contact us when there's been a problem as to when there's been a sense of joy or overwhelming, this is great, or potentially ambivalence. I think the people who are more likely to get in contact with us at the library are when they have a real issue or are really worried about the material that's been released online. And we do have a whole, as we'll talk about tomorrow, a whole way of approaching our narrators and explaining the materials going online. So it's not like we just take all of our recordings and just throw them out there to the world without thinking it through. We have had one case of someone whose mother was interviewed in the 1980s. They lived a particular lifestyle. They were lesbian. They were very political. And by the time we put the material online, which we had total permission to do a few years ago, that person's life had radically altered. They were unrecognisable from that person who was discussed in the recording in the 1980s. The mother had since died. They were outraged that this kind of view of themselves in the late 1980s was there available for the world to listen to. And I can understand that, but I also have to think, if I remove one person's story from that interview, do I have to remove all of the others? Where does that snowballing end? At what point do we need to make those decisions, and how can we make them equitably for one family member as opposed to another? There'll always be a case-by-case scenario, but those are the crucial things I think we have to start formulating, and I don't have all the answers. I would be very interested to hear your views on that too. I think our challenge in this world of pinpointed access as well, where you may search someone's name on a catalogue, find a track and be able to play that material straight away. It's a very different experience to pre-internet access, where you would have possibly had to visit an archive, look through a card catalogue, talk to a librarian, find a tape, fast forward through and find the exact part you want to listen to. By going through all those steps, you actually would have imbibed quite a lot of context about how that material was cared for, looked after, thought about, all the different steps you'd have to go through. A simple click and listen is very, very empowering, but also means it's very hard to reconvey that context into the listening experience. And I think that's one of our prime challenges is at the moment with online catalogues and online access, is to think about how we can convey context in a pithy manner and to have more conversations between oral historians and web developers. If you say to a web developer, I'd like to have a big information box before anyone listens, explaining what oral history is and clicking through, they'll all turn white in the face and tell you absolutely no way. And I can understand that too. That will obviously stop some people listening. But we also need to have enough information so that someone can understand and contextualise that small part that might be about their grandmother that they're listening to within the wider context that this is within a 6-hour interview, was recorded on all these different things. It will have talked about lots of other people in a similar manner within the interview. It hasn't just picked out just one person to talk about in detail. What we're going through now within the a large grant that we've got at the British Library for digitising lots of our oral history recordings and our wider sound collection, and hopefully, or definitely within 10 sites around the UK, we're developing a process of trying to do some clearer sensitivity checking for our recordings. We can't possibly listen to all of those recordings. Even if we employed hundreds of volunteers, we'd never be able to listen through every minute in detail. So using some of the documentation we have, we're trying to think about how we might word search for particular words or stems of words, so that some of those most sensitive bits of someone else's lives, my daughter had an illegal abortion in 1965, that might not be something we should put on the internet. We should try and think about how we might sift out some of those things, which is a bit different from, I live next door to Fred and I didn't like him very much. I don't think that's a particular problem. So trying to think about how we go through some of those mechanics for such a large quantity of data in the thousands of hours of interviews that we have. I think it's our mission anyway as oral historians to further the general understanding and understandings of oral history within the community, as we're trying to do within the family history community, so people are a bit more aware when they click what they might be discovering. And also, as we already have within our website, but we need to do more of, is having clear mechanisms for feedback. So that if you do stumble across something that shouldn't be up there or that worries you, you can get in touch with the right person straight away. And as we do now, we take down the recording, we work through the process, and then we put it up when we've come to a resolution. So, in summary, the interview is a centrepiece for, well, it is the oral history recording itself, but also is very crucial to family history research. And I think there's a lot more to be unpacked and unpicked and talked about between those two communities. I think oral historians have a lot to offer to the family history community about recording their own interviews and storing them and thinking about ethics. I'm hoping that more family history researchers will be using archived oral history. But I think also what we need to do with the archival community, with the web developers, with family historians, is think through how this wider access has brought up some of these potential ethical issues and how we may then resolve them. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Mary, for the interesting contributions. To warm up the floor, I would like to start with my question to Mary about the range of families that you cover, like the National Family, what is the name of the whole project? National Family Histories?
National Life Stories.
National Life Stories. That's an interesting title. What is the diversity of your coverage, and how do you just wait for people to contact you, or you kind of target people in terms of communal backgrounds or age, or and what is the diversity of your archive? And there is a reason I'm asking this, of course.
I think there's two things there. There's National Life Stories and the oral history collections at the British Library, which are vast, and where we often we work in a number of ways. We have a number of deposited collections where people find something that you call you up and say, I found a whole load of tapes in my attic. They look a bit mouldy. I don't really know what to do with them. Would you like them? And if it transpires that those mouldy old tapes aren't so mouldy, but can be cleaned and also contain recordings of a national significance or national coverage, then we'll take them into the oral history department within the Sound Archive. If not, we'll refer them to a local archive around the UK. We also do lots of partnership working So we have partnership working within the academic community, but also within the community, within community history, often funded by the National Lottery within Britain, which has funded millions of pounds worth of oral history-based projects, where local communities will be recording their own history. So it's not the academic recording the history from below, it's the actual communities themselves. It's not unproblematic, but some fantastic material. And for projects that are national, we will work with the project from the very start, and we will help them build their ethics framework, all of their paperwork, all of their management of their data, and we'll take the recordings into the library. If not, we'll try and partner that project up with a local archive. And finally, we have our own charity that we run from the oral history section called National Life Stories, where we fundraise usually by particular sectors or industries for ease of fundraising, and in order to record a large life story project within those. So we seem to have done a lot of industries. We've done the oil industry, the steel industry, the water industry, and the electricity supply industry. We've got a big cultural program, so we interview artists, craftspeople, authors, there's a huge lot of Holocaust lots of Holocaust testimony within the late 80s and 90s, workers within the City of London and various banks. And within each of those projects, what we're trying to do is to get a coverage of functions, so every aspect that there would be within a particular sector, but also try and make sure that we cover the hierarchy. So we're not just getting all the managing directors, that would be incredibly dull. We're also getting the secretaries, the middle managers, the people who worked in the post room, the cleaners. You get a very different, multiple set of voices that can all reflect upon that sector's history. So that's what we've done within our work, everyday work at the library. In terms of my family history research, I think that was mainly led by which families had contacted us, and that was from a number of different collections. One was a family member of a pioneering child development specialist. There was this case within publishing. I also had some recordings within a very interesting project that we worked with, who interviewed people with from the early years of HIV and AIDS. And one lady was recorded and she then died, and 10 years later, when the project went back to re-interview its original cohort, they interviewed her son. So I had a number of different examples from across the projects that I used to think about this family history research, but mainly they were to do with life story interviews. Does that cover what you were wanting from me?
Partly I want to ask about censorship and how because this is British Library is an official library, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the state library, effectively.
And so I'm coming to your democratic, non-democratic kind of categorization. So I assume that when you collect all these interviews, you have the freedom of archiving them. First of all, you have the consent signed, and you show the transcriptions to your readers, to your interviewees, and they sign, right? And then afterwards you archive them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there is no problem in that. Or what are the kinds of problems you kind of face through the process? Or are there any problems that you encounter?
There's always problems. I mean, the British Library is the national library of, well, the United Kingdom, but there are national libraries of Wales and Scotland, so that in itself is a slightly contested point. But we have a brief for the United Kingdom, but we don't tend to prioritise the collection of Welsh language or Gaelic language material. We do have some, but so there's some. So it's not a simple story. But to answer your question, we can more or less guarantee to people that we interview that we will look after their material in perpetuity, and we will make it available with their consent. Now the issues are that in exceptional cases the courts and the judiciary can gain access to embargoed material on the basis of pursuing criminal investigation. But that's only happened, I think, twice in 30 years that I've been collecting material at the British Library. So it's pretty unusual that happens. There's been a recent case called the Boston College case, which has had a bit of a chilling effect on certain people who were interviewed. In this case, it was the police service of Northern Ireland trying to get access to interviews in North America with members of the various paramilitary forces in Northern Ireland. But it's pretty unusual. In other words, I think within our society in Britain, we can pretty much guarantee to people that we will look after the material, and if they ask us to close it or close parts of it, then we can do that and no one can get access to it. The only exception is that one that I've indicated, and that is very, very exceptional. So the issue for us is increasingly one of what happens when we make that material accessible. So the issues that Mary was highlighting, where people change their minds or the relevance of what is said over time changes, and people listen and access material for different reasons at different times. So in other words, it's not always a simple relationship with the interviewee, because you've got a third party who's listening, who may be talked about within that interview. And that's where we're in a much more challenging position in the way that Mary said. And that's really a product of the internet. You know, we never had that problem. So, you know, when I started doing it, people would come to the library, and as Mary explained, you'd have to do quite a lot to get access to things. The internet has completely transformed, it's democratized access, but it's also created many challenges in terms of the nature of the material. And particularly with cases like Boston College, there's also some evidence that the FBI and the CIA have been trawling archive material, looking for particular experiences and particular stories, because there's so much stuff online now. This is beginning, I think, possibly to change the relationship which has traditionally existed between interviewees and interviewers, and it might be that in the long term the open way in which we can operate as oral historians is going to have to change. Now that's within our society and within North America. I mean, I'm finding it quite challenging talking to people in other parts of the world, including in Turkey, of how you can actually gather proper oral history within societies where the archival structure is perhaps not developed, there isn't proper security of data, where people can have access to that data against the wishes of people who've been interviewed. You know, these sorts of issues, I think, are really challenging to us in different parts of the world now in terms of how we can operate.
Yeah, and I think, you know, archive in itself because it's written documentation, assumes a written society, I mean, it's a literate society, which in many, do you interview people who don't read and write?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah. And actually, oral history is a brilliant way to do that.
Okay.
And of course, the great thing about the internet is that for the first time, we can deliver the sound. See, for a long time, archives have been delivering the transcript, but not the sound. And there's something about the internet which liberates the oral in the oral history. So you can listen to it.
That's great, because in many societies around the world, you know, the literacy is not as, let's say, developed as in Western Europe or North America, and you have a more like the modalities of orality, you know, operating, which requires sometimes reservations when it is going interviewed and taped. Like you may have reservations of revealing your life. This is the case, for instance, me and my students, you know, over the years we've been interviewing family histories, 3 generations of histories. And also the meaning we assign to archive may differ from country, society to society, where, for instance, the meaning of a signature in Turkey, where you give consent to your interviewing institution, means a relationship, a kind of a legal relationship with the state,
Yes.
And
Which
so
was true of
people can tell you
Eastern
a bunch
Europe.
of their stories,
Yeah.
full life stories, very rich narratives about their life stories. When it comes to giving consent, they would say,
yeah. And you know that's true in Northern Ireland, because the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland is seen as a state organisation, and a lot of oral historians working in Northern Ireland have not been happy about putting their material in that particular archive. I think the British Library is not regarded as an apparatus of the state in the same way that certain other national archives are. And in that sense, we're lucky, I think, Mary, aren't we? I think that's true. That's certainly not true in other parts. I mean, certainly not true and before the end of apartheid. Again, the archives, national archives of South Africa, were seen as a tool of oppression, because they actively, destroyed records from a certain period. Now, we now know there were some very, what shall we say, subversive archivists who actually were not destroying what they were being asked to destroy, and they were hiding documents and hiding archives. And there's a whole story about now archives being rediscovered who they thought had been destroyed. So there are subversive ways of archivists working even within those sorts of oppressive regimes. But I'm not under any illusion that even the British Secret Service is not, exempt from criticism, because, as we know, in a recent book published by a Guardian journalist called Ian Cobain, many of the records of British imperial rule after independence were destroyed by the state. So there's quite a few court cases going on in parts of the former British Empire against the British state. For instance, the treatment of Mau Mau in Africa, where the records were just destroyed by the British state. So, the point about that is they never got to the archives. They were destroyed before they were archived, and many of them were hidden, but they are actually there. So there's been a big campaign recently to rediscover this. So, I hold my hands up. We're not, it's the same in Britain as well to some extent.
One other question would be about empowering dimension of the institutions. Once we make an institution of oral history, we create a power domain. See, we can interview people we want, and we can archive the narratives that we like, This is possible, if you establish your own NGO and your own thing. And this may actually happen in places where there is diversity and a kind of a domineering oral tradition, oral culture. So one of the reasons I'm not for the National Association of Turkey, I'm so afraid that this will become a kind of a power circle where certain types of narratives will be collected and some others won't. So maybe the best is that communities, within a society produce their own oral history projects with a maybe consortium, which I believe that we already have, not in an official way, but everybody knows everybody. So, so to my understanding, actually we have a national oral history consortium with different interests and different kind of research, like we do here at the Hrant-Dink Foundation.
It's very interesting, because I was at the meeting where they set up the Greek Oral History Association. They had exactly the same argument. Is this creating something we don't want?
Yeah.
Because it removes power in a way.
And remember, in 1996, there were a group of people who didn't want that the oral history movement become an association, exactly because of this power-creating ground that may cause. Anyway.